This is Marengo from Command Post Games. I have to call this an uncylindering video because this is literally how it ships in this cylinder. This is the container as well as the shipping material. Wrapped in plastic. Arrived on my door just like that. Out of the plastic. This is one of their pub battles titles. The idea behind them is that they should be played publicly, literally at your favorite public house. So they're a little simpler, but they have pretty neat materials. That's what I want to look at here. So after wrestling with it just a little bit, the end comes off and the bits come out. The map is all rolled up. Everything is contained inside. And it's kind of an interesting texture. It's not paper. It's sort of a canvas, almost feels like wallpaper. And inside are all the bits and pieces, the rules, quick start as well as the rest of the rule book, and that's the rule book. The pieces are all these wooden blocks. And they come flying out. Obviously they're supposed to be in their little bags here, but some pieces come out. And they're the Austrian army. Bunch of blocks. There's a couple of the French army there. And the rest of the French army. So a bunch of blocks. Like what? But where they get their distinctive markings is from the little stickers. These look like Austrian. Those are some French. And this tells me how to affix the stickers essentially in the guise of an order of battle. So there's a bit of a craft element to this. Some assembly required, which isn't so bad. It's just affixing a bunch of stickers to these blocks. I want to look at how it comes out of the box, and after I get it assembled, we'll continue with sort of another uncylindering to show how quick it is after assembly, how quick it is to lay this out and get it playing. So I've completed most of my craft project. I have the stickers on all of the blocks. These of course are the combat units. They're described as demi-divisions. I might think of them as brigades just to simplify it. These little round chits are the command chits. Essentially you throw them in a cup and you draw them out, and whichever one you draw, that's the one who gets to move. And then these square ones are the headquarters. And so they represent command on the map, in relation to their units. But my craft project isn't quite over. I'm going to have to manufacture a couple of measuring sticks. This one represents the distance that cavalry mounted can move, and this represents the distance infantry can move. Which is a good segue into looking at the map. To a certain extent, this was the biggest appeal for me. This is this sort of period-looking map depicting the terrain there. And getting down on it, here is the titular town. Going all the way to this side, we see the big town and the river. And the idea is this is supposed to look like a commander's map. And it's supposed to feel like a commander's map. You notice there are no hexes, no areas. It's just a map. And the reason you need the measuring sticks is because it's kind of the miniatures way of moving. You measure out space for each piece, and that's how far they can move. Now, the publisher suggests using a compass, or they do sell pre-made measuring sticks, but I couldn't tell if those were appropriate for this game or not. They were specifically described as being scaled to another pub battle title. So I figured I'll just throw together one of my own, or two of my own, really. Kind of hard to get the whole map in. This is looking east. You can see it kind of goes all the way there, representing this whole very long field. Just to get a sense of scale, that would be one piece on the map. And if I had my measuring stick, I could figure out that I'm able to move, that far with one turn, or, to there. And different terrain costs, as well as changing facing, can consume movement as well. This is not a setup. This is just how pretty it's supposed to look. Every map we've ever seen in any, most histories, this is what we see. These lines representing the formations, and arrows showing how they're moving. So this takes the same approach. The formation is here. It's not really meant to be a fog of war thing, because in the event that you become fatigued, you actually flip the counter or the block up. And this shows the piece needs to be rallied. I'll get into that later. But it just looks kind of cool looking at it. And when you're going to engage in combat, the idea is you move adjacent and basically touch them. And you can establish a flanking position just like that. So it looks very much like a map from a history. After completing my final craft project, my homemade and homely made, I'm afraid, measuring sticks, I was able to get the game playing here. So, how does it play? Each of these squares is a headquarters. And each of the headquarters corresponds to one of the round chits, which is a draw chit, command chit. What you do is you take all the chits that are available at the time of play, several are reinforcements for the French, put them in a cup, draw one at a time, and whichever one draws gets to move. When you've completed all draws, all pieces have moved, then you go on to combat, which is essentially fire combat between the opposing pieces. And that's it. That's the turn. And you basically start a next turn, put your chits in a cup, and start all over. So if I were to draw a chit here, D, what's D? Well, each of the headquarters is a command. That's one command. Just so happens that corresponds to, can we see that? To say the French. So that means he could move his force. See, he's here on the left of the French position. If we look at the Austrian position, the mass of their strength is here in the center and on their left. They're very weak on the right. So the basic French plan is to move this way and strike the Austrians here in the flank while maintaining their center position. So Desai could move along the road here to get into contact. That's where this measuring stick comes into play. Every combat unit, infantry combat unit, or artillery as well, can move one stick per turn. Stick is divided into three pieces because terrain and as well as facing changes, can cost a third of that movement ability. So suppose I wanted to, I think this is in road column. I think if I wanted to move him out of road column, it costs me 1/3 of a movement, and then I could move 2/3, like so. So there, that gets the first unit there. Then I could move the headquarters, again by the same rules, and this last unit would end up about right there. So that's how the measuring sticks measure movement on the map. No hexes, none of that, just movement in space. So how do they fight? Well, I'm just going to cheat a little. We will draw a chit, which is L for Lan, which is this headquarters right there, meaning I could move these two units in his command. So right now they have two Austrians opposing them. So I could, I think I get one free change of facing. And using my measuring stick, I could figure out that I could move him either straight ahead or obliquely 45 degrees. And then I can probably get into contact with him right there. So that is contact, meaning they're going to fight. I can move another piece. I'm just eyeballing it because I know it's well within the one stick distance, into support. And in theory, I need to have my headquarters in range of 1/3 of a stick of pieces in order for them to be able to make contact and attack. So generally, you move your headquarters first, and then your combat pieces. It's a little bit of a mechanical, but just a way to make sure that you're in command when you're fighting. So now these pieces are basically ready to fight. Now I draw the rest of the chits and finish the movement portion with one difference. Suppose I draw a chit, and it's for the Austrians. It's their big center command. Every command that has not yet moved can actually roll a die, and if they meet their command rating, they can sort of take initiative and seize the move. There's actually two ways to do that. One is to jump and move immediately, and there's another one called delay. I don't think I quite understand that one, but in a simple sense, you could roll here for Victor. Maybe he achieves the initiative, and then he moves instead of the Austrian command. Just a way to get your own forces moving if you have better command, which, the French do. So we would finish all of our moves, empty our draw cup, and then we would go to combat. Now, in all likelihood, when I would draw for this command, I would retreat them because they're exposed over here, outnumbered, and they wouldn't want to get into a combat that would destroy them. But I'm going to leave them there just to demonstrate. Combat is basically the bucket of dice method. Each side throws 3 dice, and the results of those dice determine the outcomes. So a 4 or more on a die is a hit. 3 or less is a miss. We have 4 pieces here. 2 are in direct contact. These 2 would be shooting at each other. These 2 are said to be in support. Infantry in support. And this happens to be an artillery unit in support. Now, artillery in support on the defense enables the defender to fire first and record their casualties. Otherwise, fires are considered to be simultaneous. So in this case, we would throw our dice for the Austrians and record our casualties on the French target. I like to throw dice electronically, so this is what the electronic dice came up with for the Austrians. 1, 5, 1 hit, and then 2, another miss. So that would cause this unit to become spent, but not retreat or eliminated. Now the French could fire their 3 dice in return. So the French roll very well. 4, 6, 5, that's 3 hits. So that would be a spent. They would then have to retreat, which retreat is a third of a stick based on the unit, be it cavalry or infantry. But because there's a third hit, a hit on a retreated spent unit actually destroys the unit. So these Grenzers would be killed in that combat. Now supporting units at the end of a round of combat like that have an option to advance to continue the attack, but actually supporting artillery is a little different. They can't advance. So because there's now space in between, that would be the conclusion of this combat. But if this were an infantry piece, he could elect to advance, in support, and continue the combat for another round. As long as units are in contact, there is a possibility of combat. But it also affords the opportunity to retreat out of contact at the end of a round. So maybe these French don't want to be there, and they could retreat, again, third of a stick, to get out of the way. And leaving the gap, there would be no more combat between those two. Now this being Napoleonics, there are cavalry. Cavalry have the advantage of being faster, of course. These are the relative sticks. The longer one is for cavalry movement. But they also have the ability to effectively charge. This is a cavalry unit, and they can move, attack at the same time, whereas infantry move and then in the combat phase attack. So here this cavalry unit could have essentially fire on that infantry. And, being cavalry, that means they could potentially force them to retreat or become spent. Now, it's not too detailed. There's no counter charges. I think at some point during the life of the game development, they had some idea that they were going to allow infantry to form square, but I think that must have been dropped. That's one of the small bits of errata in the game. There's a few things with the setup here, which is kind of interesting, this setup. It's a little map, shows the area where the Austrians can set up initially and where the French set up along with their reserves. Also shows where their reinforcements arrive. But there's a goof, they have the wrong turn numbers on the reinforcement. Not a big deal. But there's also a mention of infantry forming square in the rules, but that's not the case. There doesn't seem to be anything else about that. I think it's just a leftover. And the last little bit of errata, is the initiative draw, die roll you can use to try to seize the move from your opponent. There was some weird rule about how if your opponent started to move, you could actually then roll and force them to go back to where they started. I'm glad they thought better of that, because that would be kind of complicated. And they now require you to perform your initiative before your opponent starts to move, at the time the chit is drawn. And the only other kind of special ability is for artillery. They can, in lieu of movement, during the movement portion of the turn, if they are within range of their HQ, they can then fire their artillery strength as a bombardment attack. I think it's within one infantry move, so that would be one stick for infantry. As long as he had a line of sight, he could attack instead of moving. So that's a ranged fire attack. So I gotta say, this is really kind of fun. The pieces and the components are kind of cool. The rules are not overwhelming, so they get you into the game quickly, and you're playing, a very different style than most hex and, map counter kind of gamers are used to. But it is fun. I mean, it's not a detailed Napoleonic study, of course, but it definitely gets you in the flow of the game, in the flow of the battle, and the map and the pieces sort of make you feel like you're a commander, mapping out a strategy for the fight. So I think it definitely is a winner in that regard. It also is pretty darn expensive. I mean, this is not a huge game. It's going to play, the publisher suggests about an hour, hour and a half. I think that's about right. Even just picking it up, it's not going to take much longer than that. But at its price point, it might be kind of off-putting to many people because it's just not so big. But I do think there's replay value. I think there's definitely visual appeal and enough historicity to keep you interested, and even touch on one of the unique aspects, which of course is, the Guard and their special ability as elite units makes them stronger and more, immune to casualties in the game, so they can absorb more hits before becoming spent, and therefore do more damage. So both sides have an elite unit. Both sides have cavalry. Austrians have a ton of artillery. And we have this big game map, so it's a really interesting problem to try to solve in games terms. And in that respect, I think it reflects the history pretty well. I blew a lot of time making my silly homemade measuring sticks. It'd be kind of nice if they had that as part of the package. But I can also see using the protractor, as maybe even a more historic kind of means for measuring. I just was afraid of sticking, the pin of the protractor into the map and possibly damaging it. So I do advise using some kind of measuring stick as opposed to the protractor, unless you have one with blunt ends. While the map is appealing, it actually does have its challenges from a playability standpoint. Maybe I should... This is all of the terrain key. There's not much to it. Woods, hills, streams. So hills and streams, those can be a little challenging to figure out. Like, I think these are hills right there. Because it says something about 2 slopes. So I think that's a slope and that's a slope. And that would, cost you movement to cross. Streams also cost movement to cross. Now the river is pretty easy to pick out, right? I can figure that one out. Is that a stream? Right here? I think that's a stream. Obviously it's coming right off the river. What about this thing right here? Kind of looks like a stream just because it's all curvy, but there's nothing on the map to name it or really indicate that's what it is. So that makes it a little bit of a challenge, especially for the Austrians in the beginning, because they're crossing the river and there's all this stuff in through here. I think that's a stream. This one is clearly a stream, but I'm not sure about this one. Maybe it is, but then it makes a right turn here. Seems to go under the road. So, road or stream, not sure. But that's about the only aspect of the map that I find challenging. The rest of it I like a lot. So maybe the real question is, would I play this in public? I mean, I think the components would hold up just fine. I think it'd take a strong wind to really blow these things out of position. But honestly, for what it cost me, I'd be afraid of losing something, inadvertently, and taking the hit for trying to replace it. So I think this one will probably stay in the game room just because I want to, respect it and to kind of cherish it. I think maybe more importantly, I would purchase another of these. There are a couple of American Civil War titles that might be in the works. Hopefully those will be at a scale similar to this, and that would entice me to buy There is a Brandywine game, which I was afraid was just too small a footprint to justify the cost. This game is just large enough that I think I can swallow that and think it's worthwhile.